I have the wonderful honor today of having a dear friend of the covenant, someone that is no stranger to us, professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College, our dear friend, uh, Danny Carroll Rodas. How are you, Danny?
Good. It's good to see you again. Thanks for having me.
And I know you're a reverend and I know you're a doctor, but we are also friends. So you're among friends today. So you can call me Tocayo or you can call me Danny.
Or
Why,
just you. Hey, you.
why don't you explain what Tocayo is for the people that don't know what that means?
Yeah, it's a word we use in Guatemala, so I don't know if it's used. I think it's used elsewhere as
Yeah.
well, but it's if two people have the same name, they call it tocayo. So we're tocayo because I'm Danny, you're Danny. So
So if
tocayo.
I say Tocayo to anyone, they automatically assume that we have the same name. We don't have
Yeah.
that in English.
No, I don't think so.
No,
No.
no. Anyway, please tell us a little bit about yourself. We're not strangers to you. You have spoken at some of our events.
Yeah.
You've spoken at Midwinter, and you made all the Latino pastors cry in the front talking about immigration and the Bible. You've done a lot of work about that. Tell us a little bit about what you do now and some of your experience in Latin America.
Yeah. As you've mentioned, I'm half Guatemalan. My mother was Guatemalan, so I was raised bilingual in my culture, and I spent almost every summer growing up in Guatemala. And we had family out. My abuela, my abuelita, would come up. My grandmother would come up a couple of months every year to spend. We were in Houston. Spend time with us, and our neighbors for 11 years in Houston were my mother's sister and brother-in-law, both Guatemalans. So I was raised in that environment, and then later on, I went to work at a seminary, taught at a seminary in Guatemala City for 13 years, Old Testament. And so that's kind of my Guatemalan background. So it's very dear to me. And even though I'm very tall and have this kind of Anglo face, really what's deepest in my heart is my Guatemalan side. So anyway, so when we come back to the U.S. Several years ago, a number of years ago now, I began to get to listen to the immigration discussion. And the thing was, when I was growing up at home, it never came up. It was just who we were. And since my father was very supportive of the Guatemalan part and everything, it never really was a point of discussion. It was just who we were. Looking back, I can see some things in our neighborhood, but I just didn't process them like that.
Yeah.
But when I came to the U.S. To teach at a seminary, another one before I came here to Wheaton, I was there for a number of years, is when I began to hear the national discussion about immigration, and even from Christians. And what struck me was that it was not an explicitly Christian conversation. It was just the same as everybody else. And maybe at the end they would throw in a Bible verse or something. So that's what got me into looking at this in terms of the Bible and migration. And that led to the writing of some things and a lot of speaking and writing articles and book chapters as well. So yeah, and I do it. It's an added layer of work for me, but as we would say in Spanish, is por mi gente. I mean, I do it for my people, and so
Mm.
it's something I feel responsible. And because I can kind of go between both cultures and both languages, and because I'm a prof, I can write about such things. I think
Mm.
I can help the discussion, hopefully.
Thank you for continuing to make that a priority. And one of the things that we need desperately in Latin America is more Latino theology, as you well know. One of the things that people may not realize is that Latinos, Spanish speakers from Latin America, we come in all colors and sizes. And you're
Yeah.
probably the tallest Guatemalan who ever lived.
Yeah.
You're 6'8", right?
No, 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 no. I'm 6'6".
Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, two
Yeah,
more inches,
our,
right?
our older son actually is 6'8", and he's
Is
taller
he
than
really?
I am. So
Wow. Well,
yeah,
anyway,
yeah,
uh, yeah, I remember standing next to you, and I look like one of your legs, but that's a different story. And Latinos come. We can be, and obviously the majority of my early migration was Mexico, Central America, which are mestizos, mixed from indigenous blood, and and Spaniards, and of course you get someone like me, right? Someone with olive skin and dark hair. But then we have in South America we have Euro Latinos that are mixed from Italians, Germans, etc. And then you have the Caribbean, which is Afro Latinos, and also in all the coast, all the way from Mexico to Brazil, there's an Afro Latino component that a lot of people don't even compute. So
Yeah, and you also have, as you would know, even in Guatemala, about half of Guatemala's population is Maya, indigenous.
right, right.
And so their language isn't even Spanish. There's many indigenous languages in Guatemala. And talking about the Euro Latino in Guatemala, when Guatemala goes to the coffee economy at the end of the 19th century is when the Germans come in to run the coffee plantations. So there's an historic German presence in
Yes.
Guatemala as well. I mean, so it's quite a mix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have some of the best chorizos, some of the best sausages in the world. And I suspect our German brothers and sisters taught us how to do that.
You know what? That could be true.
Well, I don't know, obviously. I haven't done the research, but I suspect that I do know that because of the influx of Chinese that came from the States after the railroad worked and how they were dismissed, we have a Chinese population in Mexico, Guatemala, and Central America. And you well know we have something called chow mein, not jiao ming, but chow mein.
Yeah.
That we added our own vegetables to it, and now it's a Guatemalan dish. It's not even Chinese anymore.
Well, and there's millions of Japanese in Brazil. And then a number of years ago, if you remember, the president of Peru, Fujimori, was Japanese descent. So it's quite a mix south of the border.
So you've written a book, and I apologize, I don't have a copy of me yet. It just was released. You just got some copies. If you don't mind holding that up for us, please.
Yeah.
The Bible and Borders, Hearing God's Word on Immigration. Tell us a little bit about your motivation behind writing this book, please.
Yes, I wrote a book earlier called Christians at the Border, and that first edition came out in 2008. And then in 2013, I updated it, and it's this book, came out in 2013, which was just a revision of the first one. But it's been now, 7 years, and so I've learned a lot. So what the Bible and the Borders does is it pulls out the biblical chapters from the other book and updates them and expands them. In the other book, I had a section on the history of immigration, Hispanic immigration. I have history of U.S. immigration law. I've left that aside. Others now are doing that. And the law right now is pretty much of a mess, and we don't know where it's going. So I focused on the Bible. And so this is an updated, expanded discussion of what was in the other book. And I think hopefully it's going to be a handy tool.
So when you write about immigration, your specialty is Old Testament. Have you seen anything that kind of intertwines with immigration, and what has been your research and your practical application of the Old Testament on that?
Oh yeah, very much so. Because I think if we go even back to Genesis 1, where we're told and commanded to fill the earth, in my mind, I just wonder if that's just telling us that migration is part of the human DNA. We fill the earth by moving, and the history of humanity is the history of migration. Any country in the world, that's part of their history, their ongoing history. And so it's not surprising that when you get to the Old Testament, what you have are migrations of all kinds. You have people migrating for food, people migrating because of war, people being forcibly displaced because of war, all kinds of reasons where people are moving. So what you're going to find in the Old Testament are a lot of similar experiences to what people experience today, because the migration experience has a lot of similarities across the centuries. Mm-hmm. What you'll also find in the Old Testament is legislation for immigration or for people from the outside. And what's unique about the Old Testament, there is no other ancient law code that has anything like the amount of material that we have in the Old Testament. And if the Old Testament in some way reflects the heart of God, which it does, I think, um, Old Testament law can give us at least some ethical pointers about how we think about U.S. law. So we're not going to try to imitate ancient Israelite law, but there's some moral values and foundational concepts that are relevant. So I think there's all kinds of ways we can draw from the Old Testament and the New in different ways into this immigration discussion.
We last week we had a council of superintendents, and we took the book of Ruth to study it. And sincerely, I had not considered, though I am an immigrant. I was not born in the States. I came here as a child, and we were brought here because of the civil war that was going on in Guatemala, and there was just not a lot of place for or safety. And we were very, very fortunate to come at a time when President Ronald Reagan passed a amnesty where we became residents and then became citizens, and have had the joy of being able to have the dignity of being able to look for a job and further education. But I do remember that in the book of Ruth that Boaz, being the son of Rahab, which is not known very, Rahab being in the direct descendants of the Messiah, and also Ruth being a Moabite in Israelite land, Bethlehem. I'm sorry, Bethlehem, and just the implications of being a immigrant. And I had asked you, we had a Spanish interview already, interview in Spanish, where you see the immigration in several passages of Scripture. Is there other passages that you can point us to for us to see that?
Oh, there's so many. You could point to Moses' life having to flee, from Egypt, and his struggle of identifying with his own people. We know that from early on. He ends up marrying a Cushite, which would be modern Sudan. So that whole experience of this bicultural marriage and the movement of his own life, we go even farther back to Abraham, who comes from Ur of the Chaldees, the Babylonian area, migrates. So as he receives his call to be a blessing, he's doing this as an immigrant. He never has any land that he owns except for what he buys for his wife to bury her. So his life is a life of migration. He goes to Egypt for food, again, very early on in chapter 12 of Genesis. And if you remember the story, Danny, when they get in front of the Egyptian authorities, they lie to get across the border so they can eat. I could tell you all kinds of interesting things about that. Daniel forced migration, taken away from his home. They give him a new name. They've taken away everything he owns. Probably his family and friends would have died in the war. Now he's being trained for the empire that has destroyed his country. And you see him navigating that. And one of the things that he navigates is his food, because he can't navigate his curriculum, if you want to call it that. They've changed his name. The only space he can negotiate is what they can eat. And what they choose are things that will not violate Jewish dietary laws. So what you're seeing is, even though they change his name, even though they try to educate him to help the empire that has destroyed everything he owns and his own country, he's still a Jew. And so what you see then is all of this very complex. Joseph is another one. Joseph, the story of Joseph, of course, but when he comes out of prison after the dream, he's given an Egyptian name. Again, they rename him. He's given an Egyptian wife. But when they have two sons, he gives them Israelite names. And when his family comes, even though he pretends he doesn't know what they're saying, he has an interpreter. He knows what they're saying. He has his mother tongue still, you see. So you can begin to read Joseph as an immigrant story too. And we go story after story after story in the Old Testament. and you see it in all kinds of interesting details.
Um, Danny, why, in the Bible is full of this, and as an immigrant, for me, it's very easy to see that sometimes. But for the average a person in the church that doesn't really remember being an immigrant because we've forgotten that we are a nation of immigrants, it's very difficult to really relate. And of course, immigration is a very politicized thing. If you're in the right, you believe close borders. If you're in the open, you want to have immigration reform. Why is immigration such a political thing?
Well, I think it's a very human thing. The issue of people coming in from the outside is something that every country in the history of the world has dealt with. If you go anywhere in the world today, every country has immigration laws. And I've been in several countries in the last couple of years. I've been in the UK, I've been in France, I've been in Spain, I've been in Australia, in Argentina and Guatemala, and all of them are dealing with this. So it's not a US problem, it's a global phenomenon with numbers that we have never seen in the history of the world. So it's not surprising that people, have very deep feelings about it. The question is, especially as believers, where do we begin the discussion? Do we begin it with Genesis 1, where it's the image of God, or do we begin it in Romans 13, which is the legal discussion? In my mind, because that's about 1,000 pages after Genesis 1, let's begin on page 1, and we'll get to Romans 13, but all that stuff in front of it can help us better understand that passage and how it works. The other thing, Danny, that I would mention, because you alluded to it just a second ago, is that one of the things that you see in Deuteronomy about immigration law, what we would call immigration law, it said over and over and over again, do not forget that you were once slaves in Egypt. And what our problem is that we've forgotten. And now what you have in Deuteronomy is a series of ways to remember through the feasts, the Passover and others, where they would rehearse the stories. And what part of our problem in this country is that we have forgotten, how we marginalize the Irish. My father's father was an Irish immigrant, and he has his own stories about the ghettos of the Irish in Boston. And we forgot that at the end of the 19th, into the beginning of the 20th century, we put quotas on the Italians because they were Catholic. The largest immigrant group in the mid-19th century were the Germans. I mean, so we have a history of migration in this country, and every group that's come in has had to deal with prejudice and exclusion and segregation. Really, the most tragic immigrant story of this country are the Africans who were brought here to work. And we made them slaves. And even after the Civil War, eventually we moved to segregation. So what you're seeing in the African American community, if you look at its roots, it's an ongoing immigrant story, a story of rejection and marginalization that goes back literally centuries. And so we have forgotten so many things, and I think that's the problem. Once you forget your history, you become what your ancestors were, and you repeat their mistakes.
With immigration reform, I think there's a huge misunderstanding on what that means. Some people, when they hear immigration reform, they think open borders. They think let everybody in.
Right.
And there's a concern of a criminal, a certain group of criminals to come in as well.
Yeah.
So, what is immigration reform, and what is it that we're aiming for when we talk about having a just immigration reform?
Well, I think we need to avoid two extremes, which really don't represent where most of the country is anyway. I mean, but one extreme is deport everybody. well, you can't deport 11 million plus undocumented immigrants. The other extreme is open borders. And people involved in immigration reform really don't even go there, but I'm sure you can find someone on the internet that says such things. But what happens then is that the immigration reform position gets caricatured as that. So it's not. And I think what we need to realize as well, and this is what I call the Haman Effect. If you remember the book of Esther and Haman, he was bothered by Mordecai, that one foreigner, you see, and his solution was to kill all of them, right? That was his solution.
Mm.
So what you find sometimes in the media is they'll find, a bad immigrant, and then that gets projected onto the whole group. When we know that actually the percentage of criminality, if you want to call it that, is less among immigrants because they're trying to keep their head down, basically.
Right.
But I would say this about the bad immigrants. If you're a Christian who has any sense of theology about you, you should not be surprised. Every people group, every race and ethnicity has a percentage of bad people. So I have no need to defend bad immigrants.
Right.
There will be some, just like there's bad U.S. citizens. And so that's just humanity. But if we can get past that and understand there will be a criminal element, as there is in every population in the world in history, that doesn't answer the question about how we help the vulnerable people who are coming and asking for help and work and protection. So in my mind, even though I'm aware of the criminal element and we need to be watchful for that and do what we need to do to monitor and filter that, that should not take away from the task of immigration reform, which really has two things, and I don't want to spend too much of our time here, but one thing is how to handle what goes on at the border. That's one discussion. A related but distinct discussion is what to do with the people who are already here. And what happens is those get conflated. And they're really two distinct discussions. The people who are already here. And the problem with current US law is that there is nothing in current law that allows them to get right with the law or gain some sense of legal status. I mean, this is part of the DACA debate, right? Just a slice of it. But what we see then is when you're asking for immigration reform, you're asking to do something for 11 million people, most of whom statistics show us have been here for over a decade. So we need to deal with that as well as begin to monitor, better what's going on at the border. It's very complicated, Danny, because one of the reasons there's so many people now at the border is they come seeking asylum, which is a specific category, which requires certain procedures. And current law is not equipped to handle that many asking for that status. And so that's why you have this backlog and all these people at the border. So it's very complicated for historical and legal reasons, but we need to be informed about it, and most people aren't. They just assume that it's US law must be good, and they don't realize how antiquated, how inefficient, and how limited it is.
So when we advocate for immigration reform, would it be fair to say that we're not talking about open borders because that will not be practical, nor would it work?
Yeah.
Number two, that we're concerned about the people that are here, that don't have a criminal record, that can sustain themselves and be a contributing member of society.
They already are.
And that are willing to pay a fine to make themselves right with the law.
Yeah, I mean, my conversations have been just that just give us some kind of legal status so we can live and work and raise our families in peace. And they're already working. I mean, we know this even before this whole virus issue, that most of the people harvesting our food, a lot of the construction, landscaping, people care, nannies, all this kind of stuff, a lot of cleaning, not only of houses, but of office buildings and all kinds of things are done by undocumented immigrants. So they're already working. And so it's not that they've been sitting there, and most people don't know this, they have almost no right at all to access federal aid. They can't even get food stamps. So this is a long discussion, but what we're just asking is to set up some kind of system. And there has been discussion in years past, not now, things too polarized. There has been discussion in the past about setting up a pathway to legal status. But because it gets so politicized, it doesn't go anywhere. And the people who continually get caught in the middle, the immigrants themselves, as the politicians debate and try to gain office, they're the ones who are left with nothing.
Hmm. So, so there's a couple of things. How do we walk with people then that would say to you, well, they need to get in line, they need to get right, they need to, we're law-abiding citizens, we must support the laws of the United States. They broke the law, that's why they're illegal, which people may not realize is a very offensive term for our undocumented brothers and sisters. We don't want to use that, but that's thrown around. How do we walk with people like that?
Well, I'd say several things. Most people I talk to about this don't even know what U.S. immigration law is. It's just, in their minds, it's just there. It must be good, right? But the problem is that if they say, well, why don't they just get in line and get right with the law? Well, because they can't. Under current law, the only option is deportation. The current law was established to monitor entry. But once you're in, the system drops you. Okay? So this is why there's this whole set of millions of people that have no option to get right with the law. Another thing people don't recognize either is that about 40% of the undocumented came in legally. They came in through student visas, they came in through temporary worker visas, they came in through tourist visas, and just stayed. Over 40% of the undocumented, that's how they came. The question about what's going on at the border for them is irrelevant. They didn't even cross the border, they came in through the airports, you see? So this is where you begin to see that people don't understand either the law or what actually is going on. The other thing that I think we need to appreciate as Americans, one of the beauties of this country is that when we recognize that laws are inadequate, we change them. We do this all the time. We do this locally, we do it citywide, we do it statewide, we do it federally. And we do this all the time. Now, this is where, this might push your listeners a little bit, but this is an example I give where it gets a little more complicated. So if I go something like this, if we were in Birmingham, Alabama in 1950, segregation was legal and sanctioned under penalty of law. So the US law at that point is not very comfortable. If I say, okay, let's do Birmingham, Alabama in 1850, where slavery is legal and sanctioned under penalty of law, and it treats human beings as less than human. The Romans 13 discussion then gets a little more complicated. And now you begin to see that no matter what the law is, and no matter what country and moment in history, that as Christians, we have deeper values that we need to push for. So, that's how I would go to the discussion. And if I had time, and I do this when I do presentations, I will actually walk people through different stages of US immigration law. They begin to see that the problems we're having today are the very same problems that we had in the 1800s with the Chinese. You see, and I can go on. I can give you all kinds of examples, but
the Irish, the Italians.
It would just be the Italians. The Chinese are interesting because when the U.S. in the Mexican-American War gets 40% of Mexican landmass, which would be our western states, overnight, these Mexican citizens now are on U.S. soil. 1848 is when that is finally finished with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Gadsden Purchase. 1849, we get the gold rush. So we import, the government and private companies, we import Chinese labor. Well, eventually, as the Chinese began to multiply on the West Coast, there were race riots in California, lynchings. So eventually, at this point in time, immigration is state law. It's not even federal at this time. Okay? And eventually, immigration becomes federal about 1875.
Hmm.
And the first major piece of legislation, immigrant legislation in this country, is in 1882, which is the Chinese Exclusion Act, which forbid any Chinese to come into the country, with very, very few exceptions. And if you were born here of Chinese descent, you could not be a citizen. That law was in place till 1943. We have all these stories of just bad immigration law that were changed because they had to be, like the quotas on the Italians and the Irish and things like this. So, I mean, it's a long discussion. And if people are willing to have that discussion and really to appeal to their Christian values first, I think that's a helpful way to go.
And what we base ourselves on is loving God and loving our neighbor, right? In a way that's practical. So getting back to your book and to finalize our time together, this has been wonderful. Thank you. What surprised you as you were writing this book? Is there something that caught your attention that was really profound that you can share with us?
I would say, as I've done the writing that I've done, the thing that is constantly surprising to me is the amount of material in both testaments. It's everywhere, across every part of the Old and New Testament. I think that, and the fact that migrants are dear to the heart of God. I mean, Deuteronomy 10, God says, you will love them because I do. I don't know if there's a better motivation than that. Yeah. And I think the other thing, and lastly on that, Danny, when I share this material with the majority culture, they're surprised by the amount. They didn't even know that was in there. And when I share it with Latinos and Latinas, they're surprised because they're not even used to reading the Bible that way either. I mean, you even mentioned that, right?
Right.
But when you begin to unpack the stories and the legislation and all this kind of stuff, what they begin to see is that esas son nuestras historias. Those are our stories. Ahí estamos nosotros. I mean, we're there. And now the Bible begins to take on a whole different dimension for them that it won't for the majority culture, because now they actually see themselves in the text, and their experiences are resonating with the biblical stories. And I think that is something that's really hit me. And the challenge of getting them to see it, because they can't even see it until someone begins to point out to them that it's there. So those would be the things that have surprised me.
We're going to put a link to where they can get your book at the end of this clip, and so that we can start reading and being challenged. So a series of quick questions that require quick answers. You ready?
I'm ready.
So what's your favorite Guatemalan food?
Oh, something very basic. Black beans with salsita y queso seco, right?
Yeah, colados o enteros.
Yeah, volteados.
O volteados. Okay, so like fried.
And on a Guatemalan tortilla, because the Mexican tortillas are very thin. The Guatemalan ones, as you know, are smaller and thicker.
Yeah.
Get the tortilla hot off the comal.
Oh,
with un frijol negro con queso blanco y salsita.
It is lunch hour, so what's your best place to relax in Guatemala?
Oh gosh, I would say two places. One is my aunt's house. She's like a second mother to me. And the other, and I'm sure you would know this, Danny, is La Antigua.
You like La Antigua, huh?
Yeah, yeah. I love Antigua. Just to be
Antigua,
able to enjoy the history. It's a
uh,
colonial city.
it's a beautiful city. Antigua, Guatemala, for those of you that had not visited Guatemala yet, hopefully you'll visit one day. It was the original capital of Guatemala that was destroyed by a volcano. But it's colonial homes that are hundreds of years old and just a beautiful place. And we have a surprising amount of Americans living in Guatemala.
Yeah, because they get tax breaks to
They,
retire there,
I'm
and
sure they do.
yeah, and I know they do. And with Antigua, one thing you may not know is that it's been declared heritage to humanity by the United Nations. So
Really?
by law, every street is cobblestone,
Yeah.
and no building can be over 2 stories high by law, and everything has to have a colonial front. So it is still a colonial city,
It's
and
absolutely gorgeous.
yeah, it is.
So I was going to ask you something else about Guatemala, and I forgot. But
Okay.
it's always this. Hopefully, won't be our last conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for representing your gente, your people well. And I look forward to reading the book and calling you and asking you questions about it.
Estamos a la orden, hermano.
Muchas gracias. Thank you, my brother. Bless you.
All right, blessings to you too. Thank you.